Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, Ellen Carillo, has written a new book from the Modern Language Association called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. The book addresses a chronic issue with web-based digital content: how to gauge credibility, authority, and bias of digital sources. The issues here aren't new. Ever since we started publishing to the web, there have been tactics for verifying content credibility, but over the years, the sheer volume of content published to the web, along with rapidly changing technology, the introduction of the social web, and the many ways people are gaming the system are causing information professionals to perpetually adjust their strategies for tracking and evaluating the digital content marketplace. It's not hyperbole to say, indeed many are already saying so, that the amount of disinformation, bias, and other kinds of manipulated digital content on the web are serious threats to our democracy. And that very issue plays a key role behind the scenes in Ellen Carillo's book, where it's ever more important for students to understand what digital literacy is and the skills necessary to achieve it, not only for their post-secondary research, but to remain informed citizens. In this final episode of our four-part series, Ellen, who is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut, talks about how to read laterally, whether authority even exists online anymore, and the roles bias plays in digital literacy. I'm curious, what does the necessity of lateral reading say about authority, if anything? I mean, this might sound a little dramatic, but I mean, is there such a thing anymore, or at least knowing, quote unquote, something is an authority, or are we stuck with having to rely on a bunch of secondary sources to form some kind of version of or get at the truth?
So I like to think of this in more positive terms, not that we are stuck having to rely on secondary sources, but that we are lucky to have ready access to all of these other sources that can help us corroborate whether someone is an authority or something is authoritative or credible. This mysterious way of just knowing that something or someone is an authority is problematic because you can't teach that. Right? So how do you teach students to judge authority if it's just something you know? Instead, lateral reading breaks down the mystery and gives students a tool that allows them to capitalize on our access to many sites and sources. And this approach also reminds us of the importance of context. The internet and the web allow us to get a larger sense of the conversation surrounding a subject. And that context plays a role in whether someone or something is an authority when it comes to that subject.
Right. So in your chapter about primary sources, and this question might send us down the rabbit hole a little bit, but you list a number of examples of primary sources. And I'm wondering how the experience and or context of, as you mentioned, where the source appears impacts whether it's a primary or secondary source. For example, if I were to watch a 15-minute pirated clip of a movie on YouTube on my phone, am I still viewing the primary source, or is this question kind of parsing out the concept of a primary source a little bit too far?
I don't think it's parsing out the concept too far. These distinctions are really important. And I think what you're pointing to is how the distinctions between primary sources and secondary sources are really no longer sufficient.
Right.
We need more and different ways of describing text. With the example of the film clips, I would emphasize that these may not be a secondary source, a source about a primary source, but they are not the primary source either. And to me, that's the important part, because who knows what the intentions are behind the chosen clips? Who knows if the clips have been manipulated? Who knows whether the order of the clips has been rearranged to suggest something not present in the primary source in the film? And so while we likely need to introduce some new terminology into these discussions, at the very least, it's important to recognize when something is not the primary source, because that means it has already been filtered for us. If we want to be able to judge a film or whatever it is we are working with, it is most important to do so using the primary source when available.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about bias and how bias impacts digital literacy. both on both the bias of the source and the bias of the person doing the research. And wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways we can mitigate bias.
Sure. So bias certainly impacts sources as well as how those sources are read, depending on the biases the person brings to the sources.
Hmm.
The first step is being aware of your own biases, the ideas, values, and assumptions you bring to a source that may impact how you are reading it. Recognizing, particularly when you have a strong reaction to a source, it might make you really angry or sad or happy, or you feel compelled to share it with someone right away. These are usually indications that something is at work here and that your biases or maybe your emotions more generally are impacting how you are understanding what you have read. Recognizing that is going on and then taking a moment to figure out why you are reacting in this way can help you understand if the biases you are bringing to the source may be impacting your response to it. Then reflecting on where those biases come from, maybe from your religion, your schooling, your upbringing, your worldview, your class, and how and why that source doesn't align with your own ideas and values are some next steps. None of this is easy, though, which is why bias is so tricky. Most of us are not in the habit of reflecting on these deep seated values and ideas. But if we make a point to do this work, we can begin to recognize why we are responding as we do, and we can begin to name the sources of our biases. We are never going to be bias free, but understanding how our biases affect how we make sense of sources and really everything that surrounds us is an initial step toward a more sophisticated form of understanding. And the same goes for sources. Because sources are written by people and for specific publications and audiences, they too will have their biases. Conducting some research about an author, the publication, and the publication's audience can shed some light on what these biases might be. There is also a useful tool, the media bias chart, and that's included in the MLA guide. And it lays out for readers where popular publications and media outlets fall on the left right continuum. Of course, the chart isn't perfect, but it provides students with some basic information that they might not otherwise know regarding outlets like where Breitbart falls versus Forbes versus the Huffington Post. And the chart brings awareness to the political leanings of these different media outlets so that if students or anyone really finds that they are relying on sources that are all from the liberal section of the chart, they should consider balancing their research by reading sources from media outlets that tend toward the conservative. Being open to different perspectives and deliberately seeking out perspectives that don't align with your own can help students and really everyone mitigate the consequences of bias.
Yeah, I saw that media bias chart, and I thought that was really fascinating. Do you recall how what some of the factors were that went into sort of how the folks behind that chart determined where some of the media outlets fell along that continuum?
Oh gosh, I don't remember the ins and outs of it, but
Yeah.
I do know that they provide a really detailed overview, if not several different overviews of how they've gone about revising the chart over the years. So there are several different versions at this point. And I know that a lot of instructors not only will have students use the chart, but they will engage students in discussions about the chart, how it came to be, how it's evolved, how it's changed, and so forth. And so this is another opportunity to be really transparent with students about the fact that no checklist, no approach, no chart is perfect, and to involve them in discussions about what actually went into the creation of it and the ongoing revision of it too, which is also really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so you list some sample lesson plans in the appendix. I'm wondering if you could just pick one of them and walk us through it. I think it might give us a sense of how to teach digital literacy in a way that talking about it maybe can't. So maybe walk us through lesson plan number 3, exploring the concept of fake news.
Sure. So, this lesson, which asks students to take a deep look at the concept of fake news, really brings together a lot of the skills and strategies students learn from the guide. The term fake news gets thrown around a lot, and so I thought it was important for students to really have an opportunity to consider that term, how it is used, where it comes from, and so on. And to do so, I wanted them not just to research the term, but to have the opportunity to create their own knowledge about it along the way. The lesson opens with an opportunity for students to reflect on what they already know or think they know about fake news. So it asks them to access any prior knowledge they have, because doing so often helps students learn new material better. From there, students are asked to read widely across the web about fake news and begin to synthesize their sources, which will likely represent a range of different kinds of sources, since the term has really risen in its use only recently. Students might keep track of sources in an annotated bibliography or similar assignment. As students synthesize these sources, they are paying attention to how the different sources define fake news, what kinds of biases they think are at play in these definitions depending on the source, and whether sources are suggesting the use of a term other than fake news to capture the same concept. From there, students then begin to construct their own definitions of fake news based on what they find in their sources. So they go from searching for, collecting, and synthesizing sources to constructing their own knowledge, their own definitions. And they do so mindfully, in that they need to be able to discuss and describe why they have chosen to define fake news as they have, including what their definition has in common with some of the published definitions they found, and where and why it departs from some of those definitions. Ultimately, the lesson leads to a formal essay assignment in which the student develops and pursues a question about fake news using the skills for locating and evaluating sources that are presented in the guide. And students build up to writing this formal essay by doing the smaller assignments I described, although any one of these assignments might be used on its own because each helps students practice skills that the guide teaches. I should say, though, that when taken as a whole, this assignment sequence could serve as a sequence for an entire semester-long course, with a week or two devoted to the smaller assignments and the last several weeks devoted to the writing and revision of that formal essay. And I really encourage anyone who's listening who teaches a first-year writing course, a first-year seminar, perhaps a library or a research course, or even a civics course, to take a look not just at this sequence, but at some of the other sequences in the guide and consider how you might integrate them into your courses. I do think that they have wide applications, and I've developed them with that in mind.
All right. Excellent. Well, Ellen Carillo, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
You just heard from Ellen Carillo, author of a new book published by the MLA called The MLA Guide to Digital Literacy. Ellen is Associate Professor and Writing Coordinator at the University of Connecticut. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.